Hey guys, tonight we're going to step straight into one of the strangest, most ironic, and most quietly humiliating royal scandals in Tudor history. The nightmarish marriage that the mighty Henry VIII himself wished he could erase, until the day he realized the only woman who ever treated him with genuine kindness was the one he threw away. And if you think you've heard every Tudor disaster before, you're not going to survive this one. Because it isn't just messy, it's a royal catastrophe wrapped in political panic, wounded male ego, and a twist ending so absurd that even historians still shake their heads. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how our little midnight history circle is scattered across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Henry VIII was desperate not for affection, not for romance, but for survival. England stood isolated, surrounded by Catholic giants, France pressing at one side, Spain tightening its grasp at the other. Henry needed a powerful political ally, and that ally arrived in the form of a German princess named Anne of Cleves. She wasn't chosen because of beauty or charm. She was chosen because her family ruled a Protestant stronghold ready to support England. Marrying her was supposed to save Henry's reputation, his power, and his place in the European chessboard after the death of Jane Seymour left him emotionally unsteady and politically exposed. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's most trusted strategist, swore that this German alliance would reshape Europe. Everything looked perfect on paper until Anne of Cleves herself arrived on English soil, wearing German silks and carrying a face the king was not prepared for. Hans Holbein's portrait of Anne had convinced Henry she was dignified, gentle, and pleasing. But the moment Henry saw her in person, after foolishly disguising himself in one of his misguided romantic gestures, something inside him snapped violently out of place. He insisted she looked nothing like the portrait. Worse, he declared that she stirred nothing in him, which was Tudor code for my royal masculinity has gone on strike, and it is definitely not my fault. The king was furious. He yelled that Cromwell had deceived him. The marriage that was meant to save England suddenly hung by a thread woven entirely from one man's disappointed ego. Anne, who had absolutely no idea what English courtship looked like, simply smiled politely, believing the king's bizarre behavior was a cultural custom she would eventually learn. The wedding happened anyway, but it felt like a funeral march for diplomacy. Henry avoided examining her face, avoided even attempting conversation, and on the wedding night, the crucial moment meant to seal the political alliance, he walked away claiming she repulsed him. He complained that she looked older than expected, that her body displeased him, and that her breath offended him. What he did not mention was that his leg ulcers were worsening. His weight made movement painful, and his self-image had cracked long before Anne entered the picture. Anne's innocence didn't excite him. It reminded him of his own aging body, his insecurities, and the truth he didn't want to face. And while Henry stormed about like a wounded bear, blaming portraits, ambassadors, and God himself for his dissatisfaction, Anne behaved with a composure that stunned the court. She stayed calm. She stayed dignified. She stayed polite. She did not attack Henry. She did not question him. She did not publicly complain. She simply endured the chaos swirling around her while Cromwell scrambled to repair the political fallout. Eventually, under crushing pressure, Cromwell engineered an annulment, a chaotic spectacle that nearly destroyed the Tudor court from the inside. But here's where the story flips. Anne of Cleves accepted her new fate with graceful intelligence. Henry offered her money, estates, jewels, and a title, the king's sister, in exchange for stepping aside peacefully. Not only did Anne accept, she adapted so effortlessly that everyone was stunned. She became the wealthiest of all Henry's former wives, free from danger, free from marriage, and quietly influential. She attended court events, appeared at celebrations, and laughed alongside courtiers while Henry's new political plans crumbled around him. And then came the twist. As Henry's health worsened, as his marriages collapsed one by one, As his confidence cracked, something unexpected happened. He began to seek comfort from Anne. The same woman he had rejected became the one presence in his life that brought him calm. He invited her back to court frequently. He talked to her more gently. He trusted her judgment. And he realized, slowly and painfully, that Anne had always been the most stable, kind, and emotionally grounded partner he ever had. He had humiliated her. He had blamed her. He had discarded her. And then he regretted every moment of it. By the end of his life, Henry respected her more than any other woman he married. Anne outlived him. She outlived Jane Seymour. She outlived Catherine Howard. She outlived Catherine Parr. She outlived Thomas Cromwell. She outlived the chaos that nearly swallowed her. And she died peacefully wealthy, admired, and completely free. The woman Henry wanted least became the woman who survived best. And now, as we drift deeper into this series, we're going to unravel the world that shaped Anne long before England ever heard her name. The quiet, strict childhood, the political machinery behind her marriage, and the unexpected strength that made her the last woman standing in a dynasty built on destruction. It's strange how a story that begins with royal humiliation quiets itself once the noise fades, settling into something softer and far more human. And as we move gently from the blaze of part one into this slower, deeper night, it becomes easier to sense the faint outline of Anne of Cleves long before she ever walked toward Henry's collapsing world. Because her story did not begin with a disastrous wedding or a king's wounded pride, but with the rhythm of an entirely different land, a quiet German court sealed behind cold stone, where duty weighed heavier than romance, and where girls were taught to obey before they were taught to dream. Anne was born into the Duchy of Cleves during the year 1505, a place ruled by rules rather than emotions, a world shaped by modesty, Lutheran discipline, and the absence of anything resembling the glittering extravagance of England. She had no music tutors sculpting her into a courtly performer, no French masters teaching elaborate flirtation rituals, no access to luxurious cosmetics or polished court manners. She grew up learning to embroider, to maintain silence, to walk with gentle dignity, and to obey the political strategies her parents whispered in shadowed hallways at night. In Cleves, survival looked different. It was not the sharp-edged diplomatic warfare that ruled Henry's court, but the slow, unspoken pressure of duty pressing into the bones. Anne's upbringing left her unprepared for English expectations, not because she lacked intelligence, but because she lacked exposure. At home, young women were not meant to sparkle. They were meant to endure. She did not dance in extravagant French steps. She did not flirt with veiled sarcasm. She did not know the courtly songs that English nobles thought all refined ladies should recite effortlessly. Instead, she carried the quiet strength of someone who had been raised behind fortress walls where subtlety mattered more than brilliance, and where a woman's value lay not in charm, but in loyalty. And strangely enough, it was that very loyalty that Europe eventually noticed. Her brother, Duke William, saw in her a valuable diplomatic piece, not a sacrifice, but a bridge. Europe was a chessboard of religious tension after the Reformation. France leaned Catholic. Spain roared Catholic. The Holy Roman Empire trembled at the shifting winds between Protestant and Catholic princes. England, after Henry's dramatic break from Rome, stood dangerously alone. So when Thomas Cromwell searched for a political lifeline to stabilize the king's reign, the Duchy of Cleves glimmered like a lantern in a storm. A marriage to Anne would bind England to powerful Protestant allies and give Henry a shield against those who wished to crush him for defying the Pope. Back in Cleves, the possibility of marrying a king did not fill Anne with excitement or fear, at least not in the way stories usually portray young princesses waiting for destiny. She had been raised to expect duty, not passion. She understood that her life belonged to alliances, treaties, and the whispers of advisors who judged nations like pieces of fabric. Still, the court of Cleves prepared her carefully for the journey. Ambassadors described England as a place of cold winds and sharp politics, but also a land where splendor shimmered beneath every archway. They spoke of Henry as a man who once dazzled Europe, a king who hunted like a knight, danced like a nobleman, sang like a courtly poet, and ruled like a storm. The Anne who heard these stories imagined a figure carved out of myth, a king who commanded the world simply by entering a room. But by the time Anne sailed toward England in the winter of the year 1539, Henry was no longer that man. His body, once athletic, had begun its slow rebellion. The leg ulcer that haunted the last half of his life had already carved its place into his flesh. His confidence cracked easily. His mood swung like a heavy gate in the wind. His heart carried a loneliness he escaped only through power. Anne did not know she was sailing toward a king terrified of aging, terrified of weakness, terrified of being seen as anything less than the magnificent warrior prince he once had been. The journey itself was cold and unforgiving. Winter seas clawed at the wooden hull, and Anne, tucked into thick German furs, remained steady through it all. She did not complain. She did not cry. She watched the waves with the quiet, unblinking patience that would later become her greatest weapon in England. When she reached English shores, ambassadors recorded that she stepped onto land with poise, unaware that every moment from that point forward would be judged through a king's wounded pride and a court's sharpened hunger for drama. While England prepared to greet its new queen, Henry planned something that would unravel the entire marriage he insisted on surprising her, riding out in disguise like a love-struck knight from old French romances. He believed she would recognize him immediately, fall to her knees, and proclaim her devotion. It was a fantasy crafted not by reason, but by the ego of a king who needed to feel adored. Anne, who had never been trained in such theatrical customs, simply blinked in confusion when a stranger burst into her quarters, breathing heavily, expecting recognition and passion. She did what any dignified woman of Cleves would do. She offered the polite greeting reserved for unknown men who invaded her space. That was the moment everything shattered. Henry believed she had insulted him. The court believed she had failed some unwritten romantic test. Cromwell realized the entire alliance was slipping through his fingers. And Anne, who genuinely had no idea what had just happened, stood silently in the center of a collapsing political storm she did not create. Yet even in that chaos, Anne showed something the court had never seen in any of Henry's other wives, an unshakable steadiness born from a lifetime of discipline. She did not panic. She did not attempt to manipulate the moment. She did not try to charm him with skills she never possessed. She simply held herself with the same calm dignity she had carried across the sea, unaware that this quiet strength, the strength of stillness, patience, and sincerity would become the reason she survived everything that came next. As she was escorted toward the palace, she rode beneath the gray English sky with an expression that puzzled everyone who looked at her. It was not fear, it was not excitement, it was not confusion. It was something deeper, the serene acceptance of a woman who understood that life moved like a tide, and the only way to remain intact was to stand firm while the waves tried to swallow you. And as the palace drew nearer, as the court prepared to whisper its judgments, as Henry prepared to unleash his disappointment on anyone within reach, Anne of Cleves breathed in the cold air of her new home without knowing that she was walking into a marriage that would end almost as soon as it began, yet somehow save her life. The strange quiet that settled over England in the days after Anne entered her new life felt almost like the pause before a storm breaks, a heavy stillness in which every footstep echoed too loudly and every whisper seemed to carry its own weight. As she crossed the threshold of the English court, she did not know that the entire palace had already taken sides on a marriage that had not yet breathed its first full day. She simply walked with that same calm dignity she had carried from Cleves, unaware that each movement, each blink, each hesitation was already being interpreted through the fractured mirror of Henry's disappointment. Servants watched her with curiosity tinged with confusion. They expected brilliance, French elegance, flirtation, laughter. Instead, they found a woman sculpted by restraint, a woman whose silence was not emptiness, but discipline, whose stillness was not boredom, but composure. She greeted people gently, speaking in a soft German accent that sounded to English ears like a foreign wind drifting through stone corridors. And though she did not know it, every kind gesture she offered only sharpened the edge of Henry's irritation, because it reminded him of the expectations he had placed upon her portrait, expectations no living woman could have fulfilled. Meanwhile, Henry poured his frustration into muttered complaints that seeped across the palace like smoke. He told Cromwell that the alliance now felt poisoned. He insisted Anne had misrepresented herself, that her appearance offended him, that her lack of courtly skills embarrassed him. But beneath his anger lay something rawer and far more fragile, the terror of a king who sensed age catching him in the dark, a man whose own body had betrayed him for years, and who needed someone to blame for the reflection he no longer dared to confront alone. Anne, sheltered within her new chambers, sensed none of this. She spent her afternoons learning English customs, assisted by ladies who tried with mixed success to explain the unspoken rules that governed Tudor behavior. She learned when to bow, how long to hold eye contact, where to place her hands when receiving ambassadors, and most importantly, how to read expressions that spoke louder than words. These were lessons she had never needed in Cleves, where etiquette was simple and sincerity was not a flaw to be corrected. She practiced smiling in the English style, practiced small, polite phrases, practiced the delicately measured reactions expected of a queen, but no matter how much she learned, the gap between her world and Henry's world remained a river too wide for effort alone. She was earnest where the court prized cunning. She was gentle where the court prized spectacle. She was modest where the court prized glamour. And as she moved through the palace halls, the courtiers found themselves watching a woman who was utterly unlike any queen they had known, which, in its own quiet way, made her unforgettable. When the wedding approached, the atmosphere turned taut and uneasy. Henry's irritation hardened into dread, and Cromwell's fear grew so intense he hardly slept. The alliance with Cleves was his masterpiece, the political bond meant to stun Europe, and yet the entire kingdom now held its breath as if waiting for the inevitable crack of thunder that follows a streak of lightning. Henry muttered that the marriage must proceed because diplomacy demanded it, but he walked through preparations like a man approaching an execution rather than a celebration. Anne, still unaware of the depth of his discontent, prepared for the ceremony with gentle excitement. She wore the heavy English gown they had chosen for her, marveling at its jeweled patterns. She adjusted to the weight of her new crown, unsure whether it suited her. She asked her attendants whether she looked appropriate, whether she carried herself correctly, whether her smile felt natural. They assured her she looked regal, though some could not help wondering if the king would see it. On the morning of the wedding, the church glowed with candlelight, yet the atmosphere felt strangely muted, as though the walls themselves sensed the mismatch of hearts. Henry arrived looking tense, his face pinched with a mixture of obligation and resentment. Anne walked toward him with the soft, steady poise of someone who had never imagined her own innocence could offend a man she had traveled so far to meet. And beneath the solemn vows and sacred oaths, an invisible thread snapped in Henry's chest, not because Anne failed him, but because he could not bear the reflection she cast upon the parts of himself he wanted to hide. That night, when the doors closed behind them, the gulf between them widened into something unbridgeable. Henry left the room claiming exhaustion, frustration, and confusion. Anne, bewildered, simply lay in bed wondering if she had done something wrong. She asked her ladies the next morning whether kings in England behaved differently from those in Germany. They reassured her that Henry was tired, but the tremor in their voices told the truth. Something had gone terribly, quietly wrong. In the days that followed, Henry avoided her with increasing desperation. He muttered that he could not consummate the marriage. He claimed she was unfamiliar to him. He blamed the portrait, blamed the ambassadors, blamed the very air. And each time he found fault in Anne, Cromwell felt the blade of inevitable ruin hovering above his own neck, because he understood what Henry never said aloud. The rejection of Anne was not simply a rejection of a wife, but a rejection of the political alliance that had been crafted to protect England. Anne, still unaware of the full scale of this unfolding catastrophe, continued to behave with sincerity that unsettled those around her. She offered Henry small gifts, She asked after his health. She attempted polite conversation when allowed to sit near him. She interpreted his coldness not as cruelty, but as the distance of a man carrying the heavy burdens of rule. But the truth was darker, stranger, and far more dangerous. Henry could not bear the idea that he had failed as a husband. He could not face the possibility that his own body, worn from illness and age, might be the cause of the marriage's emptiness. And so he clung to the idea that Anne was the problem. That her face, her manner, her upbringing, her clothing, her entire being somehow offended him. It was easier to accuse a foreign woman than to confront the shadows gathering in his own reflection. As the weeks passed, the court's whispers grew sharper. Some wondered whether Anne understood more than she revealed. Some suspected she sensed the danger, but chose silence as her shield. Some thought she was simply too gentle to panic. But one truth became clear: Anne's calmness, far from being a weakness, was becoming a power the king could not quite destroy. And somewhere in the quiet of her chambers, as winter sunlight filtered through narrow Tudor windows, Anne must have felt the shift. The sense that the marriage she had entered with such dignity was unraveling beneath her feet. Yet somehow she remained steady. She had crossed an ocean for a destiny that seemed to collapse the instant it began. And yet she was still here, still composed, still gentle, still alive. It would take only a few more weeks before the storm finally broke. The quiet unraveling of the marriage did not explode in a single moment of drama, but loosened itself thread by thread. So silently that even those who lived inside the palace walls could not pinpoint the exact day when Henry stopped pretending the union could be saved. It was as if the entire court moved through a fog thick enough to muffle every sound. A fog filled with uncertainty, fear, and the unmistakable feeling that something irreversible was approaching. Anne, who had crossed an ocean with the calm acceptance of duty, now found herself drifting inside a cage made of rumors she could not decipher, and expectations she had never been taught to meet. Henry, meanwhile, lived in a storm of his own making. Each morning he awoke angrier than the day before, pacing his chambers like a restless animal, snapping at servants, berating ministers, and muttering about betrayal as though the entire world were conspiring to trap him inside this unwanted marriage. His leg throbbed with a familiar infection, the ulcer deepening like a wound carved into the fault lines of his ego. And every time he caught sight of his own reflection, he recoiled as though aging itself was a personal insult. His frustration needed a target, and Anne quiet, foreign, unassuming Anne became the shape his anger curled toward again and again. Thomas Cromwell felt the shift long before anyone else dared to speak it aloud. The alliance he had constructed, the marriage he had orchestrated, the delicate political web he had spun across Europe, all of it trembled beneath Henry's dissatisfaction. Cromwell watched the king closely, adjusting every plan, every conversation, every recommendation to keep pace with the man's changing mood. But nothing satisfied Henry for long. The king muttered about annulment in the dim corners of his chambers, striking the air with his cane as though punishing the shadows for daring to exist. And Cromwell, who had risen higher than any common-born man in England, realized that the higher he climbed, the sharper the winds of royal displeasure became. Anne still moved through the palace with the same gentle sincerity that had carried her across the sea, but now she sensed a strange tension building around her, as though everyone else could hear a clock counting down in the dark. She tried to ask her ladies if the king was angry with her, but they answered her questions with careful vagueness, avoiding the truth not out of cruelty, but out of fear of saying the wrong thing. Fear of admitting that Henry's mood had become a tidal force no one could predict or control. Anne interpreted their hesitation as cultural difference rather than danger, unaware that she had entered a world where silence was often the only form of survival. The pressure grew heavier when Henry began avoiding her entirely. Days passed without a single message. Meals were sent without ceremony. When she appeared at court gatherings, he kept his gaze fixed anywhere but her, and each time she returned to her chambers, she wondered if she had failed some invisible test, if her manner or her clothing or her accent had offended the king in ways she could not understand. Her upbringing had taught her that calmness was a virtue, that steadiness was strength. But in England, her quiet dignity echoed strangely in rooms filled with people who valued spectacle more than sincerity. The counselors and ambassadors who observed the situation felt the ground shift beneath their feet. They whispered among themselves in shadowed corridors about the danger of the unraveling alliance, about the unpredictable nature of Henry's anger, about the precarious future that now hovered above the head of the woman who had been queen only for a handful of weeks. Europe had watched this marriage with anticipation, expecting a powerful Protestant union that would reshape diplomatic alliances. And now the entire continent waited for the next move, with breath held so tightly it could shatter into frost. But the strangest part of all was this: Anne sensed none of it clearly enough to fear it. She had grown up in a world where marriages were practical tools rather than emotional entanglements. And so when Henry began speaking of annulment, she interpreted it not as an act of personal rejection, but as a shift in political necessity. She did not panic, did not argue, did not cling to the fading promise of queenship. Instead, she stepped quietly into a posture of acceptance, believing that if she behaved with grace, she would be treated with fairness. Henry mistook her calm for simplicity. Cromwell mistook it for obedience. The court mistook it for naivety. But beneath Anne's serenity lay something far stronger, an instinct for survival, shaped by a lifetime of discipline. A sense that dignity could outlast even the sharpest humiliation if she held her ground without trembling. When Henry finally summoned his advisors to discuss the annulment, the palace grew still, as if the air itself waited to see whether the king's rage would fall inward or outward. Cromwell, exhausted from months of emotional tightrope walking, presented the legal grounds with trembling hands. He spoke of non-consummation, of misunderstandings, of political necessity. Henry listened, nodding with a cold satisfaction that made every man in the room shift uncomfortably. The king's ego had found escape, and escape meant survival, not for the marriage, not for Cromwell, but for Henry's image of himself. Yet even as documents were drafted, even as the court braced for scandal, the one person who remained unshaken was Anne. She received the news not with devastation, but with a quiet, almost heartbreaking acceptance. She asked whether she had offended the king, and when they told her no because the truth would have been too cruel, she simply nodded. She did not scream. She did not accuse. She did not cling to the fragments of a crown she had worn for barely half a year. Her composure unsettled the entire palace, because it revealed something no one expected. Anne of Cleves did not need a crown to remain whole. And somewhere deep inside Henry's mind, the first strange flicker of regret took shape so faint, he did not yet feel it, so soft it did not yet hurt, but present enough to cast a shadow across his anger. The woman he had rejected without mercy did not break. She did not crumble. She simply bowed her head with grace that made the king's own behavior look small by comparison. That contrast would return to haunt him. For now, though, the kingdom braced itself for the moment the marriage officially died, and Anne of Cleves stepped into a new identity neither she nor Henry could have predicted. The day the annulment became official did not arrive with thunder or spectacle, but with the quiet, heavy stillness that often follows storms. A silence so complete it seemed to swallow even the sound of footsteps along the stone corridors. Anne awoke that morning unaware of how history was shifting around her, unaware that rooms she once walked through as queen now whispered her name with an odd mixture of pity and admiration, unaware that the decision being finalized would alter not only her fate but the course of England itself. She only sensed, in that subtle instinct she carried like a shadow, that something decisive was unfolding far beyond her reach. While Anne dressed in the simple garments she preferred, Henry gathered his council in a chamber warmed by low-burning fires, the air thick with tension and the metallic scent of fear. It was not the fear of war or rebellion, but the quieter, more personal terror of men who knew they were participating in an act designed to soothe the king's wounded pride. Thomas Cromwell stood at the table with parchments arranged in careful rows, his expression stretched thin, his hands betraying the smallest tremor as he prepared to present the findings. Every detail of the annulment had been crafted to protect Henry's image. The union would be dissolved on the grounds of non-consummation and pre-contract, a tidy, painless narrative that allowed the king to escape without shame. Henry listened with a cold, almost distant calm. The anger that had once burned so violently had cooled into something sharper, something that carved space inside him for self-justification. He did not see Anne as a woman with thoughts and fears and hopes shaped by a lifetime far from England. He saw her as a political misstep, a reminder of aging flesh, a portrait that had betrayed him or perhaps revealed too much truth. And so he agreed to the annulment with the ease of a man removing a thorn from his finger, not realizing that the thorn was his own reflection. Anne received the council's message in a quiet chamber, hung with embroidered tapestries she had admired when she first arrived. The ladies around her braced for tears, for outrage, for broken dignity. But Anne simply stood still and listened, her face soft, unreadable, illuminated by a thin shaft of morning light that slipped through the window's narrow arch. When they finished speaking, she nodded with a grace that startled everyone watching. She asked only one question: whether the king was safe, healthy, and satisfied with the decision, and the simplicity of her query silenced the room. The council offered her the terms of separation. She would no longer be queen, no longer bear titles tied to the throne, no longer share the king's bed or represent England. Yet she would receive a generous settlement of houses, lands, jewels, and lifelong income. She would be given the honorary title, the king's sister, a unique status that allowed her to remain within the royal family without facing the dangers that had consumed Henry's other wives. The court expected her to hesitate, to negotiate, to cling to the fragments of power she still possessed. Instead, Anne accepted everything calmly, signing her name with steady strokes, sealing her fate with a quiet dignity that made even hardened diplomats exchange uncertain glances. What no one predicted was how Henry would react to her composure. When he was informed that Anne had agreed without protest, without anger, without a single unguarded outburst, something unexpected shifted inside him. It was not affection, not remorse, but a strange flicker of admiration, a recognition of strength where he had expected fragility, a kind of respect forced upon him by her refusal to break. Henry had destroyed marriages for far less, yet the woman he had cast aside now seemed to rise above the chaos with an ease that irritated him at first, then unsettled him, then gradually softened into a quiet appreciation he did not voice aloud. Meanwhile, Cromwell discovered that surviving the annulment would not be as simple as signing documents. Henry's anger, though redirected toward the marriage, still smoldered beneath the surface, seeking a more satisfying outlet. The nobles who despised Cromwell's rise saw an opportunity to crush him, whispering poison into the king's ear, reminding him of Cromwell's enemies abroad and the failed alliance that now embarrassed England. Anne, removed from the center of power, sensed Cromwell's distress long before she knew his name was being etched into the edge of a blade. Perhaps it was the way officials avoided discussing him, or the way her attendants glanced nervously when his name appeared in conversations, or the almost imperceptible shift in the palace's rhythm when whispers of treason began circling like crows above a battlefield. Though she barely knew the man, she understood enough of courtly currents to feel the tightening of a trap being built around him. As the annulment rippled through England, something even stranger unfolded. The people liked Anne. Commoners who rarely cared about royal marriages found themselves sympathizing with the foreign woman who had been pushed aside so swiftly. Her gentleness, her modesty, her quiet endurance endeared her to a country that usually fed on scandal. In marketplaces and taverns, they murmured that she had done nothing wrong, that she carried herself with dignity, that she seemed kinder than the women who came before her. And in this unexpected swell of public affection, Anne found the first fragile seeds of a security she had not anticipated. Henry, noticing this shift, grew curious. He summoned Anne more frequently, beginning with polite visits meant to demonstrate goodwill, then evolving into longer conversations that eased into late afternoons. He discovered, to his surprise, that Anne was pleasant company, warm, unintimidating, sincere in a way the Tudor court rarely was. She laughed softly at his jokes, not out of fear, but out of genuine amusement. She listened without flattery, responded without manipulation, and offered him a glimpse of peace that none of his other relationships had provided. The irony settled slowly into Henry's bones. The woman he had declared repulsive had become the only person who did not fear him, the only one who did not demand anything from him, the only one who could sit beside him without stirring old wounds or new accusations. Even as he pursued Catherine Howard, a young woman who lit up his vanity like a torch, he found himself drifting toward Anne in moments of quiet, as if some part of him recognized the safety she carried like a cloak. But while Anne flourished, Cromwell's world collapsed. Within weeks of the annulment, Henry's patience snapped. Accusations rose like tidal waves. Cromwell was arrested on charges of treason and heresy, charges as hollow as the king's excuses for the failed marriage. Anne learned of his fate through terrified whispers in the corridors and felt a heaviness she could not explain, as though the chain that had once bound her to the king's decisions now pulled tight again, except this time around someone else's throat. She understood, finally, the true nature of Tudor power. She had escaped not because Henry was kind, but because she had been lucky. Her gentleness, her calm, her distance from courtly games had made her unthreatening and allowed her to step aside without resistance. But others were not so fortunate. As summer thickened through the year 1540, the palace shifted again. Anne moved quietly into her new estates, adjusting to a life that felt surprisingly comfortable, while Cromwell awaited the verdict everyone already knew. And through it all, Henry walked with the weight of decisions he pretended did not trouble him, unaware that the woman he had discarded would soon become the ghost of regret he could never quite escape. The strange calm that followed the annulment did not last, because beneath the polished floors and embroidered tapestries, beneath the murmured greetings and hollow smiles, something darker was moving inside the Tudor court, a slow tightening of threads that would pull one man toward destruction even as it allowed another to breathe freely for the first time in months. And as Anne settled gently into her new identity as the king's sister, the palace around her trembled with the anticipation of a reckoning that had been building for years. A reckoning aimed not at her, but at the man who had orchestrated the marriage she had now quietly stepped out of, Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell had always understood that power in England was not something a man held. It was something he balanced, something he juggled, something he survived by anticipating danger before it arrived. But after the annulment, the danger he sensed did not whisper from shadows or hide inside foreign threats. It thundered directly from the throne. Henry's disappointment over the Cleves alliance had crystallized into something poisonous, something that sought an outlet violent enough to restore the king's pride. And Cromwell, whose brilliance had once made him indispensable, now stood alone at the mercy of a monarch searching for someone to punish. Meanwhile, Anne moved into her new residence with the calm acceptance of someone stepping into a life that felt strangely gentler than the one she had been promised as queen. Her new estates were quiet, with soft gardens and wide, open halls that carried none of the suffocating tension of the royal palace. She spent long afternoons arranging tapestries, walking among flowering shrubs, and discovering the small freedoms that came with being connected to power without being trapped inside it. For the first time in her life, she had control over her days, a luxury none of Henry's wives had ever known. And yet, even in her peaceful retreat, she felt the shift in the air whenever she returned to court for celebrations or formal gatherings. Something in the hallways had changed. The courtiers moved with tight shoulders and averted eyes. The laughter in the great hall rang too sharply. The king himself was restless, pacing with the heavy gait of a man who sensed that justice, or something masquerading as justice, had not yet been satisfied. Anne noticed it most clearly the first time she met Henry after the annulment. He greeted her with a softness she had never seen before, a strange, almost sheepish warmth that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. He asked about her comfort, her health, her estates. He smiled, not with the grandiose self-assurance he had once flaunted like a polished suit of armor, but with something quieter, something that hinted at the first tender, unconfessed realization that he might have misjudged the woman standing before him. But the court was not watching Henry. It was watching Cromwell. Whispers began to thicken like smoke drifting through narrow corridors. They spoke of treason, heresy, reckless ambition. The nobles who had always despised Cromwell, those who hated his rapid ascent, his reforms, his power over the king, sensed his vulnerability and closed in with the patient hunger of wolves. And Henry, tired of feeling exposed, tired of bearing the weight of decisions he no longer wished to own, allowed their voices to seep into his thoughts. The arrest came on a summer morning in the year 1540. Cromwell arrived at the council chamber, expecting another strained discussion about foreign alliances. Unaware that this day would mark the end of the world he had built stone by stone, he greeted the nobles, handed the king's secretary a stack of reports, and began adjusting the sleeves of his robe, a simple gesture. Familiar and unremarkable, when suddenly the Duke of Norfolk rose, voice cold, eyes gleaming with triumph, and declared him a traitor. Cromwell froze, stunned, caught between disbelief and a lifetime of political instinct that told him movement, even breath, might worsen his fate. The guards stepped forward, chains clattered softly. The council chamber hushed, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. And in that terrible silence, Cromwell understood that the king had abandoned him, that the anger Henry had once aimed at Anne had found a new target, sharper and more satisfying. Anne heard the news hours later, whispered by a trembling lady who could barely meet her gaze. For a moment, she said nothing, only bowed her head and clasped her hands as if steadying herself against a wave she had long sensed, but hoped would pass her by. She had no reason to love Cromwell, no reason to hate him, no reason to defend or condemn him. Yet she understood that he had been the architect of the life she had barely entered before stepping away from it, and that his downfall would echo across the court long after the doors of his cell were shut. For Henry, the arrest brought a burst of satisfaction so potent it soothed the sting of his failed marriage. He declared Cromwell guilty without trial, condemned him without hesitation, and spoke of justice with the arrogance of a man who had convinced himself that he, and only he, could determine the moral shape of England. Yet beneath his triumph lurked something he refused to acknowledge, a flicker of doubt, so small he could push it aside, but present enough to whisper that perhaps the man he was destroying had only ever tried to serve him. Cromwell was taken to the Tower, where he sat alone with the knowledge that he had risen higher than any man of his birth had dreamed, and that such heights always demanded a sacrifice. He wrote letters pleading for mercy, but Henry ignored them. He sent messages of devotion to the king, but Henry tore them without reading. And in the end, Cromwell understood that his downfall was not political. It was emotional, the result of a king who needed to blame someone for the discomfort of his own reflection. Anne, meanwhile, discovered an unexpected consequence of Cromwell's fall. The court's attitude toward her shifted yet again. Now that she was no longer tied to the political strategist who had orchestrated the alliance, she became harmless, almost invisible, a presence no one feared and many admired. She visited Henry's court as a friend rather than a wife, sitting beside him at feasts, offering soft conversation that soothed him in ways he did not yet understand. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Henry began to rely on her presence. He trusted her sincerity because she had nothing to gain, valued her calmness because it expected nothing, and sought her company because it carried no demands. Anne did not try to be queen. She simply existed with gentle steadiness that made the chaos of his life feel less sharp. What she did not know, what no one yet knew, was that her quiet survival would allow her to walk safely into the future, while the man who replaced her stepped directly into the path of danger. Catherine Howard, young and radiant and disastrously unprepared for the weight of a crown, would soon draw Henry's adoration like a flame draws a moth. And the story that began with a broken portrait and an unwanted embrace would take a darker, sharper turn that would leave blood on the scaffold and regret heavy in the king's final years. But for now, the palace settled into a fragile, deceptive calm. Anne had moved out of danger, Cromwell had entered it, and Henry, without realizing it, had begun to lose pieces of himself, one regret at a time. The days that followed Cromwell's imprisonment unfolded like a quiet funeral for something larger than a single man, a suffocating hush that settled across the court, as though every candle burned more slowly and every corridor exhaled a colder breath. Henry walked through this gloom with the stiff triumph of someone who had convinced himself he had restored order. Yet the edges of his confidence had begun to curl inward, revealing an unease he could not name. And while the palace trembled beneath the weight of Cromwell's fall, Anne of Cleves continued drifting gently along her own path, unaware that the calm she carried within her had begun to echo in Henry's private thoughts with a softness he could neither deny nor admit. Anne's new life unfolded with a tranquility that would have seemed impossible only months before. She woke in rooms warmed by morning light rather than the icy tension of the court. She walked through gardens where flowers swayed without the watchful eyes of nobles judging her every movement. She ate meals slowly, without the looming expectation of royal etiquette. And in this gentler rhythm, she began to reclaim parts of herself she had barely known were missing an ease of breath, a sense of belonging not tied to power, and a quiet joy in the simple fact that she had survived something many thought would destroy her. When she returned to court for feasts or celebrations, people noticed the change immediately. She moved with the same quiet dignity she had always possessed, but now it was wrapped in a softness that came from security rather than restraint, from the knowledge that she no longer carried the burden of fulfilling another man's expectations. Her laughter, rare in the early days of her marriage, now flowed more naturally. Her voice, once hesitant, carried a new warmth. Even her steps seemed lighter, as if leaving the throne behind had lifted something heavy from her shoulders. Henry noticed it as well. At first, he responded to Anne's ease with confusion, then curiosity, and eventually an unspoken admiration that flickered in the corner of his expression whenever she entered a room. He invited her to dine with him more often than anyone expected, sometimes during grand feasts, sometimes in small quiet chambers where music hummed softly beneath the crackle of fire. Their conversations ranged from politics to stories of her childhood, from the rhythms of German life to the small absurdities of courtly etiquette. Anne, who had once felt lost in England's theatrical customs, now laughed gently at them alongside the king, and Henry, weary from years of turmoil, found comfort in her sincerity. It was one of the great ironies of Tudor history that the woman Henry had rejected so swiftly became the only one with whom he could relax without fear, the only one who spoke to him without trembling, the only one who offered him companionship without ambition. With Catherine Howard now shining at the center of his attention, young, effervescent, reckless, Henry found himself drawn to Anne's steadiness when the noise of the court grew too loud or the weight of kingship pressed too sharply against his ribs. Anne did not compete for affection. She did not seek influence. She did not pry into matters of politics or succession. Instead, she offered Henry something infinitely more valuable, a safe space, a quiet presence, a reminder that not all relationships demanded blood, ego, or fire. And though Henry would never admit it aloud, this was precisely what made her irreplaceable in a way none of his other wives had ever been. Yet the palace, always hungry for spectacle, began to spin its own tale. Some wondered if Henry regretted letting her go. Others whispered that he sought her company more than he sought Catherine Howard's. A few, braver or more foolish than the rest, speculated that he might ask for her back, that the annulment might somehow be undone. But Anne, hearing these whispers, brushed them away with the gentle dismissal of someone who understood the value of peace. She knew she had been given a gift none of Henry's other wives had received: freedom, wealth, safety, and she would not risk that freedom for a crown that had proven itself more deadly than divine. As summer deepened into the year 1541, the court shifted its attention toward Catherine Howard, the king's new queen, whose youth sparkled brightly enough to distract England from the execution that had silenced Cromwell only months earlier. The palace brimmed with music and dancing once more, and Catherine basked in admiration she believed would last forever. But beneath her radiant surface lay a fragility no one yet recognized. A fragility that would soon shatter under the pressure of her own past. Anne, observing from a distance, sensed the imbalance. She saw how Catherine's laughter trembled with the nervousness of someone performing a role too large for her. She saw how Henry's adoration bordered on obsession, the kind of a feverish affection that could warm a heart one moment and incinerate it the next. She saw how courtiers watched Catherine with sharp eyes, waiting for mistakes they could use as weapons. Anne, who had once stood in the same place, understood the danger more clearly than anyone, and perhaps she felt the first quiet ache of pity for the young girl who had stepped into a position that devoured queens one after another. But while the kingdom's attention drifted toward Catherine, Henry began to confront something he had long avoided, the hollowness that followed the departure of Cromwell. For years, Cromwell had been the engine behind Henry's ambitions, the architect of reforms, the mind Henry leaned on when the world grew too tangled. And now, in the wake of his execution, Henry found himself surrounded by nobles who flattered him but did not challenge him, advisors who echoed his thoughts rather than shaped them, men who feared him too deeply to offer truth. The king, who had once commanded the brightest political minds in Europe, now sat among shadows that bent around his desires rather than guiding them. Anne, without meaning to, filled part of that void simply by existing near him. She did not advise him in matters of state, but she offered something he had forgotten how to receive: honesty without threat, companionship without manipulation, warmth without motive. Her presence softened him in small ways, made him laugh unexpectedly, eased the weight in his shoulders during long hours of political tension. And though she never reached for power, her influence seeped into the court in subtler, quieter ways, reshaping perceptions of what it meant to coexist with a king who had devoured so many lives. Yet Anne was wise enough to know that whatever affection or respect Henry felt for her did not protect Catherine Howard. The storm forming around the young queen gathered far from Anne's peaceful corner of the kingdom, and she could do nothing but watch as the signs began to darken. Whispered accusations, veiled threats, hidden secrets from Catherine's past creeping toward the throne like cracks in frozen stone. But this part of the story, Anne knew, was not hers to carry. Her survival had already been secured. Her peace had already been earned. Her life had already stepped beyond danger's reach. The court, however, had not, and neither had Henry. The months that followed unfolded with the quiet inevitability of a shadow stretching across a room at dusk, lengthening slowly, softly, until it touched every corner. Anne, living peacefully in her estates and returning to court only when summoned, found herself observing the shifting tides of power with the detached clarity of someone who had walked through the fire and emerged untouched. She felt the tremor that lingered in the halls, the subtle tightening of whispers, the restlessness humming beneath the laughter that filled feasts and dances. Henry, despite his attempts to appear revived by his marriage to Catherine Howard, carried a heaviness that clung to him like a second cloak. Catherine Howard, radiant in her youth, danced brightly at the center of the king's attention, but her radiance flickered at the edges, quivering like a candle that burned too quickly. The court adored watching her, the way she giggled behind jeweled fingers, the way she lingered near musicians, the way her eyes revealed secrets she thought she concealed. Anne saw it even from a distance. Catherine was not built for the machinery of the Tudor world. She was a girl who had been handed a crown forged from iron and blood, a crown that had already worn down 5 queens before her. And where Anne had survived through stillness, Catherine tried to survive through sparkle, through sheer, frantic brightness. Henry adored that brightness at first. It distracted him from the void left behind by Cromwell, distracted him from the pain in his leg, distracted him from the gnawing insecurity that age carved deeper into him each day. He walked through the palace with new vigor when Catherine smiled at him, and for a brief moment he believed he had regained the vitality that once made Europe tremble. But vitality borrowed from youth fades quickly, and Henry, once a king admired for his strength, found himself chasing after a feeling that slipped through his fingers no matter how tightly he clutched it. It was during one of Anne's visits to court that she first sensed something was dangerously wrong. Catherine moved with an anxious energy, glancing over her shoulder as though someone had whispered a secret directly into her bones. Her smile was too wide, her laughter too sharp, her gestures too large, all the marks of someone trying to outrun a shadow that had already caught up. Henry, oblivious, basked in the attention she showered upon him. But Anne, watching from the corner of the hall, recognized the signs of fear woven beneath Catherine's silk-draped joy. Anne had no malice toward Catherine. In truth, she felt an aching sympathy for her, a young woman thrust into a world she did not understand, surrounded by enemies who wore friendly faces, and tied to a king whose love was both intoxicating and lethal. Anne understood better than anyone the crushing expectations that came with Henry's affection, the impossible balance required to satisfy a man who demanded adoration, even as he recoiled from anything that threatened his pride. She had escaped that dance by a twist of fate, but Catherine was still performing it with desperate, trembling grace. The rumors arrived quietly at first, drifting through the palace like ash, whispers of Catherine's past, of old relationships, of secrets buried beneath the fragile glamour of her queenship. And as the whispers wove together, forming a thread that pointed towards scandal, the courtiers sharpened their attention with the predatory focus of men who had watched queens rise and fall enough times to know the signs. They waited, patient and hungry, for the moment the thread snapped. Anne did not know the details, but she knew the pattern. She knew how swiftly affection could sour in Henry's heart, how mercilessly he could turn on someone he once adored, how deeply he needed to blame others for the fractures that ran through him. She remembered the way he had spoken about her after their failed marriage, not with reason, but with wounded pride. And she sensed that Catherine, with her youth and her secrets, stood on a precipice so narrow that even a single misstep could send her tumbling into ruin. Henry himself felt the tremors before he recognized their meaning. He sensed Catherine slipping away from him, sensed a distance not measured in footsteps, but in glances that lingered too long elsewhere. His mind, already steeped in old insecurities, began to twist innocent moments into shadows of betrayal. And once that suspicion took root, it grew quickly, curling through his thoughts until it choked everything else. Anne saw the shift in him the next time he summoned her. He spoke less of celebration and more of disappointment, less of joy and more of unease. He tried to hide it beneath bluster, but the truth glimmered in the heaviness of his eyes, the stiffness of his shoulders, the way he swallowed before speaking as though his words were edged with something sharp. Catherine's glow, once blinding, had dimmed in his mind, replaced by questions he did not yet dare ask aloud. Anne listened to him with the calm attentiveness that had become her greatest gift, offering no advice, no judgment, only the quiet presence he had come to rely on. She did not push him to explain. She did not pry into details. She simply sat with him. And in that silence, Henry found a strange solace he could not find in anyone else. It was as though Anne's gentleness smoothed the jagged edges of his thoughts, giving him space to breathe, space to be vulnerable without feeling weak. Yet even Anne could sense that the peace would not last. The court, always eager to feast on scandal, began circling Catherine with the inevitability of vultures who had smelled decay. They watched her every move, listened to every whisper, gathered every rumor, and Anne, observing from the distance of her new, safer life, felt the old Tudor sickness rising again, the sickness that consumed queens like fire consumes dry wood, swift, merciless, unstoppable. Still, she could do nothing but witness. Henry's affection, once so fierce, now flickered with the instability of a candle burning too close to a draft. Catherine's fate was beginning to unravel, and Anne, who had survived by knowing when to step back, understood that the tragedy approaching had nothing to do with her, nothing to do with diplomacy, nothing to do with the alliance she had once embodied. This storm belonged to Henry and Catherine alone, and in the quiet of her chambers, perhaps Anne realized the deepest truth of her life in England, Sometimes survival was not a matter of winning power, but of knowing when to let go of it completely. The fall of Catherine Howard was already beginning, and the regret that would haunt Henry's final years was stirring inside him, slow and dark as winter rain. The fall of Catherine Howard unfolded with the terrible quiet of a candle guttering in a draught, the flame dancing wildly for a moment before collapsing into darkness, leaving behind the scent of smoke and the heavy stillness that always lingers after something bright has died. Anne, watching from the distance of her peaceful estates, felt the tremors before the news reached her in words. The court's laughter had changed. Its music had dimmed. The shadows beneath its gilded walls had stretched longer and darker, as though the palace itself sensed the tragedy approaching and braced for its weight. When Catherine's secrets finally burst into the open, it was like a storm tearing through a fragile garden. The rumors hardened into accusations. The accusations twisted into confessions. And Henry, whose affection had once burned with the heat of a man desperate to feel young again, found himself staring into the abyss of betrayal, not the betrayal of a girl, but the betrayal of his own illusions. His anger returned with a violence that made the entire court tremble. His grief hollowed him, carved deep lines into his face, tightened his grip on power, and deepened his dependence on rage to make sense of the chaos he had unleashed. Anne heard the news in fragments, as though fate wished to soften the blow by breaking it into pieces small enough to swallow. She learned first that Catherine had been placed under guard, then that Henry refused to see her, then that the council had assembled evidence so damning it required no trial, and finally, that Catherine Howard Young, radiant, trembling, had faced the executioner's block in the year 1542 with a heartbreaking cry that echoed through the centuries that she died a queen, but wished for the grace to have died the wife of the man she truly loved. It was a death that chilled Henry to the bone. Not because he regretted the execution, the king rarely permitted himself that luxury, but because it forced him to confront the same truth he had been avoiding since the disaster of his marriage to Anne. That power did not protect him from loneliness, that rage did not erase his mistakes, and that the more fiercely he grasped at control, the more unstable he became. The court saw it too. They watched Henry move through the palace like a man aging by the hour, his footsteps heavier, his voice rougher, his temper flaring with less provocation than ever before. They whispered that he had begun to fear his own decisions, that the ghost of Catherine Howard followed him down long corridors, her youth a cruel reminder of everything he had lost. And in this hollowed-out place, somewhere between grief and denial, Henry once again turned toward Anne of Cleves, not out of desire, not out of politics, but out of a strange, aching need for familiarity that did not cut like a blade. She greeted him with the same calm warmth she had always offered, asking nothing, demanding nothing, simply allowing him to exist beside her without expectation. It was this simplicity, this gentle quietness, that soothed the king more than any proclamation or sermon ever could. When Henry looked at Anne now, he no longer saw the disappointment he had once raged against. He saw the steadiness he had taken for granted, the kindness he had mocked, the loyalty he had dismissed. He saw a woman who had walked through humiliation with a grace he could never have matched. A woman who had outlived scandal, survived political catastrophe, and found peace in a life she shaped with her own hands. Slowly, painfully, the truth began to settle in his chest like a stone. He had wronged her more deeply than he had wronged any other wife, and she had been the only one strong enough or gentle enough to forgive him without saying a word. Yet Anne never used his remorse as a tool. She never clung to the crack in his armor or twisted it into power. She continued to live quietly, visiting court when invited, returning to her estates when dismissed, moving through the shifting tides of the kingdom with the same serene patience she had carried since the day she stepped onto English soil. She became something unexpected, not a cast-off queen or a political bargaining chip, but a figure of stability in a dynasty built on volatility. Even Mary and Elizabeth, Henry's two daughters, admired her in their own guarded ways, sensing in her something maternal, something safe, As Henry grew older, the fragility of his health revealed the depths of his regrets. His leg ulcers worsened, his breath grew heavy, his moods darkened into long, brooding silences. And each time the weight of kingship pressed him into despair. He remembered Anne, the woman he had discarded, the woman he had misunderstood, the woman who had never once turned away from him even when she had every reason to do so. She became a gentle echo in his memory, a symbol of the tenderness he had rejected in his younger, more reckless years. And then, as all kings eventually do, Henry slipped into the cold quiet of death in the year 1547, leaving behind a kingdom riddled with fear, doubt, and the echoes of decisions that haunted those who survived him. His passing sent ripples across the realm, shaking the foundations of every life tied to the Tudor crown. Queens who had loved him, feared him, or died because of him became names whispered in candlelight, stories told in frightened murmurs. But Anne lived on. She lived through the brief reign of Edward, watching the realm shift into Protestant hands. She lived through the fiery return to Catholic rule under Mary, who nonetheless treated Anne with startling respect. She lived long enough to see Elizabeth rise to the throne, ushering in a golden age that burned with intelligence and ambition. She watched the Tudor dynasty reshape itself again and again, each transformation a testament to England's restless spirit. And through every reign, every upheaval, every storm, Anne remained untouched, a quiet figure in the background, steady as a stone in a rushing river. She died peacefully in the year 1557, surrounded not by bloodshed or scandal, but by comfort, affection, and the quiet admiration of those who had come to see her as something rare, a Tudor survivor who walked away whole. In the end, the woman Henry rejected became the only one who outlived him, outlasted his mistakes, and escaped the curse of the crown with her dignity intact. Her story, whispered softly through the centuries, lingers as a gentle reminder that strength does not always roar, that survival is not always won through conquest, and that sometimes the greatest victory is simply knowing when to step back from the fire and let it burn without you. And perhaps, somewhere in the restless afterlife of kings, Henry still remembers the woman he cast aside, the woman he wronged, the woman he regretted losing, Anne of Cleves, the quiet heart he never learned to cherish until it was far too late.